With the exception of queen regents, European queens tended to have no power whatsoever, except for two cases. Of course, they were rich, and so in this case, they could move things around within their nations, building estates, influencing their husbands, or flat out paying for influence. The main role of a queen in Europe was to have children for the king. This dribbled down all the way to the rest of the people. And so, in a world where the most important woman is seen as merely a person who gives birth to the next powerful person, this is what was generally thought of females in these regions. But in Africa, it was wholly different.
It's very important, and I will explain a bit later why female king is important. And I am of the Order of the Leopard. For those who don't know, the Order of the Leopard is one of the most ancient order that exists in the world. We used to initiate also the pharaohs of Kemet, that the Greeks have called Egypt later on.
This is the woman king Diambi. For Bantu people all around the world, she represents an ancient tradition of crowning a female as the ruler. She has also been crowned in other places outside of her home. Her home area is in Congo, but she has been crowned in the Americas as well by the descendants of the Luba. As she discussed in that video, she is the woman king of the Order of the Leopard of Congo. In this image, she is in Rio de Janeiro and she is being spiritually welcomed by the people. Something that you will notice often in Africa is that spiritually, females will occur more and more. There is two tribes which historically, religiously are tied to Congo. The first ones are the ancient Egyptians, and the second are the Zulus. These two very popular people make this tie very important.
We'll see later that African traditional religion can be practiced at the divine level or at the human level. Let us explain this higher practice of our traditional religion through the use of the Kemetic cosmological argument, which is a natural systematic theology.
Now, it's important for me to state that the reason why the queens of England are different than those of Africa is not traditionally to do with how Europe sees women or anything like that, but mainly the spread of Christianity, as the pre-Christian religions had a much different view. This image right here is from the Luba people of Congo, and the Luba people used to have powerful spiritual totems or items which carried power in themselves. This one here, which is used by Ngangas, which are powerful magic men or healers, or more appropriately, miracle workers, these people would use either a male or a female figure. These female figures carry a female power that can only be used through femininity. These items are called ngisi, and they could completely change the life of the person to which they are used towards. They not only reveal the true thoughts of the female in Africa, but they also show the divine femininity. This here is a recreation of a nganga. These are not special items that would be made once in a while that represent females in the spiritual context, but they would be so common that a person living and using these items would have more than one. Now, to refer back to Egypt. In Egypt, there's not a lot of words that you can use that would translate directly into the word queen. Usually the word queen is inserted, as in Europe, a person who is married to the king would be considered a queen. But in the case of ancient Egypt, it is very different, as the queen, so to speak, was really like the second in command. She held great responsibilities and had the powers and political powers to remove and issue edicts all around Egypt. Queens are known for erecting buildings in many places around Egypt, and the only person who could veto them was the pharaoh. These buildings tended to be religiously supported, as the queen did not just represent a type of human, but a divine creation, which is why they were colored in the color yellow. Now, remember in the older one, where they said there's two levels to the religions of Africa: the religious and spiritual, and then the practical. This is why, even though the pharaohs of Egypt, when shown with the queens could be only to the size of the knee of the pharaoh, but in the religious context, you can see that the queen in this image of Ramses II and Abu Simbel is put alongside the other pharaohs. Nefertari here, seen second lost after some of the gods that are shown next to her husband, Ramses, is displayed and honored not only as a human queen, or a better translation, which would be woman in charge of religious matters, but in this sense, perhaps as a god. And since the ancient Egyptian language separates gendered, she would be a goddess. This in practice does not mean that she is lesser than the gods, as goddesses has sometimes seen as the highest. Now, as you know, the divinity of most of these gods break down to infinity. The great powers within the African kingdoms must be indivisible. Although there are many names in ancient Egypt that are given to the queens, there are some that are more important than others. Now, here's the difference, though, between the Christian sections of the world and the traditional African. See, traditional Africans are polygamous, and we know that Ramses' other wives had power too, and they also erected their own buildings and had political power, less than the Great Queen. So, in other words, they too were not just there to give children, but instead were very powerful. The keyword power, again, might be seen completely as a practical thing, but this was also a religious thing. In other words, wherever they went, they carried a certain level of divinity with them. And of course, with the typical African thing, they don't just carry it in a symbolic sense, they carry it for these people as a practical, as the spiritual and the practical were basically the same things to these people. And so you might have libations, or you might have pouring out of water, in which you will need one of these queens to do it, or someone of a great chieftainness or chieftain, female chieftainness to do it. Although the queens of Egypt were very powerful spiritual people, and at one point they became the gateway between the world of the gods and the world of the living, this did not happen immediately. This position was once a title held by priestesses. Again, this arcs back to Africa. There are powerful priestesses all over Africa. Well, you can call them priestesses if you want, but what they are diviners. These female diviners hold the difference between the spiritual world, historically and in the future, and the king cannot access this world without the permission of these priestesses. In Egypt, these priestesses were called God's wife of Amun. The God's wife of Amun served as a portal for the king to the other world, and they held great power. These people did not act as just a ritual, as in other places where you see females being exploited for the purpose of men and being used as a ritual between ceremonies, when in real life they're being used for their female appearance. But as you can see, they carry the same whip that a pharaoh would carry. In later years, this position would be held solely by the pharaoh's wife. But for the preceding times, before the 18th dynasty, when they started to mix these two titles, the position was held by a priestess of Amun. These priestesses of Amun, being most powerful, were only one section, as there were priestesses of different things, like the priestesses of Horus. But the official title name is God's wife of Amun. So they were not necessarily the wife of the pharaoh, but the wife of Amun. So in the practical world, they are the wife of Amun. This is why they bring these two together. In Congo, amongst the Luba, the women who held this title were called Lubumbu, and these women held the same powers and the same positions as those of the queen's wife of Amun. They carried their own scepters, and they had great practical power in the real world and could mark out territories in the olden days and tell other people how to officiate or officialize their lives. They also served as healers and keepers of the faith and history. It is important to separate what you think of African religion and reality, as these people were taken as seriously as, for example, the Pope. If we read here, Belumbu divination entails trance states. When a male diviner is in a trance, he is called Bwana Vidya. A female diviner in a trance is Bifwa Wikwa, associated in Luba history with kinship. Bilumba diviners are looked upon as important links to the past, those capable of being in touch with and possessed by Luba cultural memory. They are spirit mediums, and in their possession state, they are likened to the rising moon, shedding light upon darkness. This, of course, arcs back to the word Nyanga, which also means moon. Nganga, which is, I've noticed, not linked to the word moon, but instead of divinity. But in later years, this word, Bilumba, in places like the Swahili coast and in the Zulu regions, would be mixed together with the word Nyanga, which also means moon. As you can see, they hold the exact same position as the god's wife of Amun. The oldest version of this title, of a title of this nature, of a wife to a god, is the wife of Min. In the older days, even older than these, before the word was tied strictly to a specific god and carried on in the smaller cults or the smaller religious sects within the ancient Egyptian mythology, the word hemet necher was used to refer to the god's wife or the priestess or god's servant, who, as you can see here, is a female because of the T. Hemet Necher doesn't necessarily refer to the queen or anybody close to the royal systems, but instead refers to these women who are the pathways for many people, including the men, even men of religious status. They were the gateway and the keepers of knowledge of previous eras from the religious point of view, and from the other side, the gods, the practical life between this one and the next. It is interesting to note that two worlds will collide whenever you look at this. Whenever they say there is the divine and the practical, today we separate these in the secular world, but this is not what they meant in the past. What they really meant was that if you look at it like a pyramid, the brown line or the red line representing the practical, and the purple line overlapping over the red representing the spiritual, where they intersect at the very top. This is where the priestesses come together. And there is a purpose why it should be represented as a pyramid, because most of the people fall in the bottom section of it. To some level, they are religious and have the ability to tap into religion. Just like today, the average person can pray or something like that at the gods, whereas back then they had practical things. In other words, you could write something down, leave it somewhere, and expect that something would happen. But at the very top, you have the priestesses who can communicate. And at the very tippy top, you have the people who are just straightforward. They have easy access to the other world because they live in both worlds, and they commit these trances where they fall over and they're basically in the next world, at least according to their religious systems all over Africa. Although the focus was mainly in North Africa, so Egypt, and Central Africa in Congo, this is true for West Africa as well. And if you've ever watched the documentaries by the BBC called The Lost Kingdoms of Africa, you will realize that every time there needs to be a permission in a traditional way, they always go and fetch a female to come and open for them. So, for example, in the documentary of Great Zimbabwe, they went and fetched an old female priestess, and she basically was sitting there and asking the gods if they have permission to go through. If she said no, then they'd have to go home. This is their practical power. It doesn't matter if you're the king. It doesn't matter if there's a whole army. It doesn't matter what's going on. If they say the gods have not given you permission to go past, you don't. Now, to be fair, 90% of the time, all they have to do is ask, and you will get permission to go through. In special occasions, like when certain stars or weather or situations, or even if the priestesses are not in a well position, then the gates will be closed and can't be opened because they are not in the right state. In Ghana, the female who holds the separation between the divine and the real is the Okomfo. The Okomfo is the person given permissions, or the person who is allowed to give permissions in spiritual realms. Now, she serves a much bigger purpose, and it's not only a female position, but there are a lot of females in this position. In fact, for the Asante, There are places that you just cannot enter because they are areas withheld for ritual ceremonies and are only open and cannot be deforested, they cannot be practically used, and must only be entered by very spiritual people such as the Okomfo. The only reason that this person can enter is because they are divine and are a crossroad between the two. Now, this crossroad is not some ritualistic thing. This person is practically half God, half human. And this is true in all ways. That's why most of these people are picked rather than trained. Their training will happen, but usually they are picked by the gods themselves. And they can have some kind of ailment, or they can have some indicator that they have divinity within them. In other cases in Africa, it is passed down from son to son or daughter to daughter, but that's more rare. Something that is highly typical of these priestesses in Africa, and you can see this also in ancient Egypt, is that they have their hair braided. For the Zulus, they usually have the red hair braided, usually short, but in some cases very long. In their hand, they carry this whip or African fan, which they dip into liquids and administer in the spiritual realm and the practical. Inside of Ethiopia, too, these women are braided and covered with white powder or white paint. Now, this white is very relevant to what I have to say, but first let us read what they say about these priests and priestesses that play an important role. The traditional religion of these Ethiopians, Oromo people, are called Wakefana. Wakefana, as a religion, emphasizes the same things as any other religion in Africa. But as we read, Wakefana is an ethnic religion indigenous to the Oromo people in the Horn of Africa. Wakefana, derived from the word Waka, is the ancient name of the creator in the Cushitic languages of both Oromo and Somali people in the Horn of Africa. The followers of Wakefana religion are called Wakefata and believe in the supreme being, Waka Tokicha, the one God. This is something that is also very typical. This has to do with the infinite, indivisible God. The creator of the universe has many manifestations, known as Ayana, which serves as intermediary spirits between Waka and his creations. The Ayana possess chosen men and women who are then given the title Kila for men or Kalu for men and Kalita or Kaliti for females. Now you'll notice this T sound, which is always given to females within the Afroasiatic languages. Then given the title Kalu and Kalita, Al Umma, or creatures, are believed to be assigned an ayana by Waka for guidance and protection. Wakafatas live according to Safu, the moral and legal principle that guides interactions between humans and Waka. You notice the intermediaries. Breach of Safu is regarded as sin and is condemned by the creator. The Ayana are not capable of creation, but provide a way of communicating with Waka. The Kalu, which translates as pure or holy, sacred, blameless, or black, or college of possessed persons, is an important institution in the Oromo religious and social systems that preserves and protects Oromo culture and tradition. The Kalu or Kaliti serve as high ranked priests, ritual leaders, and guardians of the laws of Waka. They live and perform ritual activities, dalalga, in a traditional Oromo hall. The Galma, the Kalu, are expected to remain politically neutral and serve as a source of unbiased deliberation. Priests are obliged to condemn tyranny and to uphold the democratic Gada system of the Oromo. The Kalu or Kaliti have the freedom to grant or withhold blessings to the Gada leadership as they see fit. Notice again the parallelness between the religious leaders and the practical leaders, that these people have great power over the actual leader. And so if they say, nope, we can't do it, they won't do it. Red is the typical color that we see face painting in Africa, whether it's protection, makeup, or any practical reason to put on makeup. But when we go to rituals, the first color that is used is white. On black skin, it pops out like nothing else. This is probably why it's so associated with the spirit realm. Now, as you read with the Ethiopian, the color black is associated with purity in some places of Africa. The color white, in this case, is associated with the other world or the other realm, so the spirit world. This is why it is used so often. And this might be the reason why most of the females in ancient Egypt have that color. If we look at the priestesses of ancient Egypt as well, you will see great similarities. An association with water, the white, almost pure pale white. I mean, look at the difference between her hands and her face. An almost pure pale white, which is associated with these people. And of course, this sort of plant like thing, and in some cases made of animal hairs, this thing that is used for water rituals for the most part. I hope you feel that this was worth the exploration. Ancient Egypt and Africa, of course, are animists, so their religion is unsurprisingly the same. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe for more content.